Hello and welcome back to a special episode regarding one of my favorite topics, which is, of course, the Master of Orion remake. I already made a video discussing ship designs that was sort of done for the pre-release version 3 or 4 or something like that. Now we're at 6, or is it 7 already? I'm not sure, but the release is coming in a few days. So I doubt they'll change much regarding the ship weapon balancing, so I'll talk about that again. If I were to do that during release, I would have to check out everything again and then be about a week too late for you guys. So let me actually do this on the pre-release version and hope that they don't make any big changes. But here's a disclaimer. What I'm about to say is currently only working for the last pre-release version, not the final release version. I have no idea how much they're gonna change or not. But I guess you can figure out most of the stuff along the way on yourself then. So, let's go back to discussing ship designs. I don't. I'm not gonna assume that you watched my previous video, so I'll just explain everything again from the beginning. If you have, I'm sorry about that. If you want to skip to the discussed ships, then there's some sort of links on the right hand side of the screen, so you can just go to whatever really interests you. Because I did something similar at the last video, I'm also gonna do a more lengthy discussion about some other observations, which in my case is about high-end energy weapons. If such interests you, I'm also going to be talking about that later, but for now, let's focus on ship designs. Alright, the smallest ship class that you can build are the frigates. You probably built quite a few of them in the beginning in order to fight back against pirates, against early aggression, and they're pretty cost effective. I mean, just cram a few rockets into one of those, and they can do quite a little bit of damage. I mean, they're also easily killed, but as soon as you can field the next bigger size of ships, just have them stay behind them or use them to flank your opponent or whatever. Frigates always can be useful to some extent. I mean, at some point they'll get outshadowed by the big guys, but they'll be useful. So the early game is probably dominated by using rockets, so this is sort of very advanced design that you probably never built in the late game, but just make a frigate with all your most current core systems, and then as special systems aim for Dauntless Guidance System and fast missile racks, and then cram as many missiles into it as you can. Regarding missiles, I think there needs to be a bigger discussion on which sort of missiles you want to cram into those, because first there's the missile types. For that, I think the guideline is clear. Use the best that you have. If you don't have the most current missile generation, like the Xeon missiles or the best missiles going down, the next would be Pulson, Merculite, and nuclear missiles. If, for instance, you're fighting against someone who has researched quite a bit, so you should be able to have Pulson missiles, but you don't have them because you chose the other choice there, then having ECM or ECCM upgrades for the missiles is probably mandatory, because you tend to not hit enemies that are using missile defenses much without it. So that's the thing. The other thing that you have to consider is, even if you have the sort of current gen missiles, do you use armored missiles? Do you use MIRV missiles? Basically, the problem is that if you use MIRV, then you have 4 warheads, so the damage quadruples. No, the damage doubles actually, but the size increases by 50%. And they can be shot down just as easy as one missile can be shot down. So if you have an opponent or an AI which tend to use quite a bit of point defense, probably not quite as much point defense as I would use, but quite a bit, then a lot of your MRV missiles will never hit the target, and you just threw some very expensive garbage at the enemy. For me personally, I had the best results with just using armored missiles. That I used ECCM here on this final design is just that I was space left over, but I couldn't cram in a 4th missile. So I could install ECCM upgrade or some point defense weapons, and I said, screw it, screw point defense guns. Let's use ECCM for the small chance that it might be useful. But as I said, ECCM is probably only useful if you're sort of lagging behind your opponent in technology and need to make up for that, because there's few ways to increase your to hit chance with missiles, but there is a few ways to increase your missile defense other than just shooting them down with point defense weapons. Talking about shooting down missiles with point defense weapons, let's go to the next biggest class. Yeah, to the next bigger class, the destroyer. In my fleet, their main task is to form sort of a protective gauntlet around my bigger ships and shoot down missiles. Like, really shoot down missiles. The range of point defense weapons has decreased a little bit, but you can still protect your other ships with it, though not all of them at the same time. And you need to be a little bit more careful with maneuvering and stuff, but I think it still works fine. Other than that, other than having point defense weapons, you want to figure out what to else cram into them. I mean, you could just cram point defense weapons into there, make your frigates the main damage dealer, and have these as a sort of protective screen around them. That could probably work out fine. But in the later stages of the game, it's useful to have them as their own to have them with limited offensive capabilities. So, like, use another energy weapon, and in the later stages of the game, install hyper X capacitors to reduce the size that you need to invest for each weapon, and high energy focus, and they can hunt down smaller ships just on their own, especially since there are quite few of them around. At least the way I played. I mean, if you've seen my previous video, you've seen that for one big ship, there were probably like 5 of those, at least. I would strive to go for like 10 of those, but it should be at least 5 of those. So they can detach and hunt down smaller ships on their own, especially if you're leading in tech. But well, there it is. You can also just cram bombs into it if you need to bomb planets in the very early game. You could also just install more missiles, of course, but that's up to you what you do it with the offensive capabilities here. I think they work fine with just without it, or with just the bare backbone of some guns, but you need to do what you need to do. So let's move on to the next ship class, which would be the cruiser. For a long time I've just ignored cruisers altogether. In recent times I have revised that slightly in order to have room for some sort of special designs that are used for special purposes, like bombing planets that have way too many infantry on them, or take down heavily shielded defensive platforms, because they're pretty much well shielded against missiles, and your energy weapons won't come to full force until the really late stages of the game. So having one ship that uses torpedoes, I mean, this used to use a lot of more torpedoes before it had other stuff that I'll talk about in a second. You can just use them in order to really help out your other guys with taking down planetary defenses. I'm not joking about this. Planetary defense can't move, and torpedoes are great against targets that cannot or barely move at all. They have really great range. Their damage is amazing, so they work really well against that. In the later stages of the game, when you don't really need it for the anti-planet and anti-planet defense function anymore, then I thought, what do I do with this ship? And in the newer version, the enemy can just randomly decide to retreat from the battle because it's not going their way. I have even seen battles where the enemy was sort of like favored by the automatic system, and I said, no, my fleet's got this, man. And we won without losing a man, and then once half of the enemy ships were down, the rest decided to flee because it wasn't going their way. In order to stop that, I have installed warp dissipators, because if you have one ship with warp dissipators, then the enemy can't leave unless they kill the ship first. And if you have it on one of your bigger ships, then the ship is not gonna get killed easily. So that helps. I also later installed some wide area jammer in order to protect against torpedoes mostly. I think I have enough defense against missiles, but since you can't shoot torpedoes down, you need something against them. One thing that you can do is move your ships around. Another thing is jammer technology. So there's that. I don't think jammers actually work against torpedoes now that I think about it. Well, I may be wrong with using jammers against torpedoes. It used to be working like this in Master of Orion 2. I'm not sure if it's actually true anymore. I think you can just move in order to avoid them, or just eat them, which is not really the best choice. So let's move on to the next bigger ship, which is a battleship. This I sort of envision this as a sort of all-purpose rocket platform that just they way just cram as many rockets into it as you can. Probably some point defense so that they're not completely helpless on their own. But aside from that, install rockets, fast missile racks, and dauntless guidance system again, of course, and then add some defensive systems to your liking because you'll probably you probably make the least amount of casualties if they're in the front line because they're the biggest ship, and the bigger the ship, the better the armor, the better the shielding, and the longer they survive. So if they eat some damage, they'll take it for a while longer. But if you lose them, then you lose quite a big of ship, of course. But by adding additional defensive systems like hard shields, reinforced hull, they'll probably stay around for a while. So there's really not much more to say about that. As you see, I'm only using armored here and not ECCM or MRV. I think armored works fine, though if you have really a large amount of them, then MRV might actually come into a positive effect. I am still not convinced, but I may be wrong on this because I'm not using missiles that much. I'm using them if I have to in the early and mid game, but I'll try to avoid them later. Because later is the time for one of these big guys. Like this Titan design. Technically you can use a similar design on battleships. Something I didn't talk about is in regards to the earlier iteration that I made, they increased the amount of subsystems that smaller ships can carry. I think frigates only could use 1 or 2 even, and destroyers were at like 3, now they're at 4. So they gave the option to use more special subsystems, which makes some designs better, because just being able to install hyper X capacitors on this and high energy focus really helps them a lot. So in the past I also used to make energy weapon battleships, but for now I've refrained from doing that because upgrading ships with completely new weapon loadouts and special subsystems costs a fucking lot, and at that point you're probably just better off building new ones and keeping the old ones around as sort of legacy versions of your ship types. But with Xeon missiles, they're powerful enough to be a force in their own right, especially if we have multiple of them around in order to overwhelm the enemy defenses. So they'll do fine on their own for quite a while. So, but if you go into the later stages of the game, then I would go to energy weapon designs. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about that when I come to the final 2 designs here, because or I can go into that right now. I'm mainly playing single player game against the AI. The AI in the battles has one fatal flaw, which is they'll always come to you if you don't come to them. So you can just cluster up your ships, put up a good defensive formation, and let them come to you. And let them come to you a few ships at a time, because their slower ships will lag slightly behind. So you can shoot down their smaller ships first, and then massacre their big guys once the support is left. So yes. But in multiplayer, I've heard that there's missile and torpedo heaven, just because they have a slightly bigger range than energy weapons. The best energy weapons have a range of 60 units. Xeon missiles have a range of 60. Okay, they also have 60. Torpedoes have a range of, I think, a little bit more. I think 80. Let me squeeze over here. 70. Alright, so technically you can use missiles against big slow battleships like this one from so far away that it can't even fire back if it has energy weapons. But the AI isn't smart enough about that. So this energy weapon boat works well against the AI. In the end I'll talk more about energy weapons and for why I choose Gauss actually and not one of the other guys, but that's a point for the later part in the video. So just make sure you really include all these subsystems in order to get the most synergies out of energy weapons, especially hyper X capacitors, high energy focus, and structural analyzer. I would also include the battle scanner or the long range master targeting unit, depending on if you use a range 50 or range 60 weapon. I'll talk more about that in the next design. And then I personally would always include hard shields. They don't really take up that much space and they can really screw things around. So, and your usual battle pods and reinforced soul, because I couldn't find any more useful subsystems. Battle pods in this pre-release version are actually a little bit weird because they also take up space but still generate additional space. It's a little bit weird. They still cost a lot and only generate quite a don't generate too much space anymore, which sometimes had me thinking about not including them on frigate and destroyer designs because they didn't really do much, but made the ship cost a lot more. So there's that. But with the larger ships, I think if you want to go for the most effective, for the most effective design per ship, and not for the most effective design per cost. Yeah, I'm only talking about to bring out the most the highest amount of effectiveness for each ship. But I guess you can discuss if you can make a cheaper design that would perform better in larger numbers, especially in the late games. Especially since in the late game your command points are not that much of an issue anymore. But that depends on a lot of things. So I will always go for ship efficiency and not for cost efficiency. But there's some points to be made about the other one too. I guess. Alright, so let's now go to the final design, to the Doomstar. Yeah, you can only build one of those. You would probably want to use a Stellar Converter. That I don't use it here is because I tend to not blow up planets, but the Stellar Converter is a pretty powerful weapon in its own right. But I wanted to get all out on the energy weapon efficiency on this one. Instead of the battles... In addition to the battle scanner, I also used the range master targeting unit here. Oh, I think I can just install additional structure here to make it better. I think I forgot that for some reason. Reinforced hull, yeah. Right. Oops. So, sorry. So, the thing is, I've noticed that with the disruptors, which have a base range of 60 units, which will further be increased by the heavy mount modifiers that you should use with it. Yeah, you were also supposed to use it with the Gauss cannons here, because heavy mount and auto fire make systems a lot more effective, as you'll see in the final discussion part about energy weapons. But I noticed that when firing on their very extreme edge of their range, they tend to miss a lot without the range master targeting unit. So I included the range master targeting unit. The problems seem to go away a little bit. But it also takes up quite a bit of space, so take that as you may. If you don't want to use the high range version of the weapons, you can probably do without this and just use gauss rifles or phasers or whatever strikes your fancy. With disruptors, I think you should use them. The reason for why I use the higher range option here is in order to have a ship against other capital ships, for one, as we'll see with the number crunching later. And in addition to that, Doomstars are fucking slow. I mean, even Titans and Battleships are pretty slow, but Doomstars are fucking slow. For them to get to the enemy, if the enemy is not moving, is just an exercise in patience. So against stationary defenses, battles will take a moment, or you can just make the time go faster and will take slightly less, but they're really slow, so getting the most so getting weapons with the highest range possible, I think, is very helpful for them. That was my main motivation for why I used disruptor cannons here, despite of what I'm going to talk about later. So let me talk a little bit about a multiplayer world. I've heard people like torpedoes there, so here's my my model for that. Disclaimer, I haven't played multiplayer so far. I might play multiplayer with friends of mine or some other people that I know from other RTSs and stuff. So you may notice that I omitted the shield here entirely, because why not? It's either shield or only 2 plasma torpedoes, so screw the shield. This uses overloaded plasma torpedoes, because Titans and Doomstars are barely able to move at all, so why use semi-guided? Just swarm them. And yeah, I guess because of the range that the torpedoes have, you could be able to hit them from far away. Um, if you really have the range advantage, is not that clear anymore when you factor in that with the heavy mount you actually have an increased range. Like these have a base range of 60, plus because of heavy mount, they have a range bonus of check times 1.5, so they should have a range of 90 actually. So I'm not really sure why people are talking about, oh, torpedoes have the superior range so much. This may be true that they have superior range when you only take into account the 50 range weapons, because 50 times 1.5 is 75 if I'm not mistaken. So there you would still have a sort of range advantage, though not really. So this is just a guess. Yeah, this is by no means a recommendation that you should use these ships, but it could be fun to have a large amount of frigates. The enemy's thinking nothing about it, and then you just unleash plasma torpedo storm on them. I would think it's fun. My counter design to that would be a destroyer with an added maneuverability, and also energy weapons, of course, because I'm advocator of energy weapons, so I need to do it with energy weapons, of course. So just install your basic energy weapon systems and then two disruptor cannons. Actually, it's still worth using the HyperX capacitors for this. You actually save up enough space to even include the high energy focus with it. It's either only these two subsystems and these two guns without any of those, or all of that plus these two. So which one will you take, I wonder? So the strategy here would be to just use the subspace teleporter to jump into the enemy frigate screen, or however, or whatever ship they're using with torpedoes, and use the maneuverability of destroyers together with energy weapons to just wipe the floor with them. So I'm not really sure how multiplayer works, but I've heard that missiles and torpedoes reign supreme. I doubt that a little bit, because missiles are highly counterable unless one side has an inherent advantage in numbers to begin with, at which point really any weapon system would work. And torpedoes just perform so badly against maneuverable ships. Just saying. Alright, but that's it for the discussion part about ships. I'll now switch to a different screen, computer and stuff, and talk more about which energy weapons are actually the most efficient. So stay tuned for that, and I'll see you right back. Well, there we are again. Sorry, I had to change a lot of stuff around, but you didn't even notice. Well, now this is sort of a final discussion that I've prepared, which is about which is actually the best energy weapon in the game. So before we come to any conclusions, let me first present my assumptions and sort of my background for where I tested this and why. Sort of the basis for a lot of the actual numbers crunched in here is this Death Star prototype that I showed you earlier, where basically my idea was I keep all the subsystems the same and also keep the couple of point defense phasers around, and then I switch the entire rest of the space and around for various types of weapons in order to find out which one would be more effective damage-wise. I'm only looking at the raw damage output of the weapons. I know there's additional considerations to be made, like the cost. I already talked about cost. I'm not interested in that. I'm looking at ship efficiency. Also, I'm looking at efficiency in the case where you have all weapons researched, and as a result of that, also the maximum amount of militarization levels. So basically, this would only be sort of applicable if you're at max tech, or when you're researching evolving techs, the final tech that you can never finish. That one. So that's sort of the basis. Additional stuff that I thought about, but that I don't know any clear answer to, is the damage formula that I'm using. I'll present them later. They're basically based on how damage was used to be calculated in Master of Orion 2. I think it works really well with what I've observed using basically any of these weapons in battle before. So I think it's pretty close to how it actually works, but I can't be correct unless I find it in a source code somewhere, or I don't know, the developers tell us or something like that, which they might not. So this is a formula. I'm trying to motivate them, but it's based on Master of Orion 2, basically. Then there's considerations being made about armor piercing, and all that stuff. In the flavor text about the armors, and also in some sort of very special subsystems, there's made numerous mentions of armor piercing effects and of armor durability and all that stuff, and no one really knows if any of that has any effect. I mean, supposedly it reduces the damage you take from collisions with asteroids if you have a higher, if you have a better armor, but does it impact weapons? And some weapons have a lot of flavor text about being able to pierce any armor. Does it do anything? Once the shields are down, they do additional damage or something? We don't really know. So there might be something there. I doubt there is, but there might be something there. Also, for all these damage considerations, I ignored range dissipation, partly because we don't know for sure how that works yet, because we don't have enough data. I would assume it works sort of similar to how it used to work in Master of Orion 2, which is that there's sort of range groups, and if you use energy weapons at their largest range groups, then they do about half to 2/3 of their actual damage, and only up close they would do their full damage, including heavy mount modifiers. There's an interesting FAQ about weapon calculations for Master of Orion 2 on gamefaqs.com. If you want to look that up for there, then he does a really good job at explaining all of that. So I'm sort of assuming that there is a similar system here. It sort of fits my observations pretty well after like 15 rounds that I've done. So, but that's also an assumption that range dissipation sort of works like that. But I haven't really factored it in here. But I'm gonna make my final choice based on range dissipation. So there's that. Another assumption that goes in here is concerning shield piercing. One of the weapons, the Gauss, does have one other special effect in addition to having no range dissipation, which is that it completely bypasses shields. Unless they are hard shields. Then it shouldn't bypass it, and that's all hunky-dory and all. But I've seen some instances where I was wondering if the enemy had heavy shields or just Class X shields, and if Class X shields actually also can stop normally shield-piercing shields. There's one round against the highly developed Cylon where some ships just seem to be able to withstand the Gauss, but I really can't see the enemy designs and what sort of subsystems they've been using, but it felt weird that they would have sort of hard shields basically almost anywhere, with some strange exemptions. So I'm not sure if Gauss actually works against Class 10 shields as it should. Which it should bypass. There's nothing stated in the Class 10 shields that it has some special properties that it should prevent Gauss from hitting it, but that would be a possible explanation for what I've seen, that basically all these ships with the Class 10 shield were basically having a special property and were able to ignore the shield piercing effect of Gauss weapons fired their way. But that's just a theory at this point, so I'm not really sure how that works. For the calculations here, I assumed that Gauss are only stopped by hard shields, not by Class 10 shields, but that might actually be different. So, already talked about that. Yes, I'm only looking at the damage modified by the shields, so I'm not only looking at the raw damage output, but I'm going one step further and use the damage formula for Master of Orion 2 to look at the damage that would hit a ship modified by the shield modifier that the ship has, for some cases that I'll go into in a minute. There's another question about that though, which is, do shields still reduce the damage once the shield is completely shot down? In Master of Orion 2, it still did. From what I've seen here, I doubt it, because ships don't seem to take less damage if they had hard shields, and their shields were really good once their shields were down. But I don't have enough observations to really present any good evidence for that. For now, it's just a theory that once the shield is down, actually they don't work at all until they're reloaded. I mean, they reload pretty fast, but I doubt that they actually still work once the complete shield is down. I think they don't reduce damage at that point, but I can't be sure about that, so I'm just putting it out there here. Alright, so let's talk about the weapons. I basically took a look at the high-end weaponry that you have available in the energy weapon category, which would be, in my opinion, death rays, phasers, gauss, and disruptors. And using the Doomstar as sort of the platform for that, I figured out how many of these weapons with the heavy and auto fire mods for all cases I could cram into the remaining space. This is the content here. My English is terrible today for some reason. Where you see the numbers of how many of how many weapons you can cram into the rest of the design, just as a comparison to how much space they're using. There's actually the disruptor and the death ray use the same amount of base space, and since they have the same modificators, it sort of makes sense that they take up the same amount of space. Phasers take roughly half the space. So there's about a factor 2 of them more. Gauss is somewhere in the middle of them, like 50% more, which actually also works well with the base space that the weapons are using. So that's sort of my input. And I take the other factors for that weapons have into account, which is this cooldown. So basically, how long weapons have to reload before they can fire again. Phaser and Gauss are a little bit faster than that. Disruptor is pretty much slower. Then here we see the range that these have. On base, the range is further modified by the heavy mount modification, which increases it to 50% more, which would be the 90 here and 75 for the other guys. And then weapons have a base damage. Death Ray seems to have a pretty low base damage, but Death Ray actually hits 3 times per shot. There's one of my other questions that I don't really know any concise answer to. Does the shield modifier reduce the damage for each of these sub-hits or only once? I don't really know. I think it should reduce it for each of the additional sub-shots. So in that case, you see the amount of damage that the Death Ray does fall off pretty steeply if you have good shields. I don't know it for sure though. So, but you'll see the formula in a second. And then this is just here for firing 3 times or just 1 time. And then using the damage formula for Master of Orion 2, we basically arrive at a damage. So basically we take the base damage of the weapon, multiply it by 2 because we have a heavy mount weapon, and then we multiply that by both the number of weapons that we have and if we shoot with it more than once. That's just our raw damage. At this point, seems like well, the Gauss seem to be pretty bad. I'll ignore the last one for now with the phasers without the heavy mount. I just did that to make a point later about heavy mounts. So it seems like sort of the disruptors and phasers seem to be in the lead, but with the Death Ray not too much behind. So, but that's not a realistic setting. Now I just looked at damage and not really at damage once it tries to hit a target, because targets do seem to have shields most of the time, unless you play against someone who's slightly crazy. So in that case, the damage is slightly modified. Basically, before multiplying it with the amount of guns that you have and with the amounts of sub-shots that you might do, you reduce the damage. After modifying it with the heavy mount modifier, you reduce it by the amount that the shield has. This is 5 dam or V dam, which because this is for shield class 5. Shield class 5 reduces the damage by 9, so for this column, I'm basically reducing the damage in this step here by 9 for each of those guns, before multiplying it again by the number of guns and the number of shots. And then in the next step, I also calculate the damage per second by modifying it with the negative speed modifier because of the heavy mount weapon, and also normalizing it to the auto fire. The auto fire is responsible for the factor 2 here. So that basically, could you stop that? Thank you. That basically gives us some sort of what is the theoretical DPS when used against an opponent with shield class 5. Here we see that there are some differences coming up. The Death Ray seems to be lagging pretty far behind the Phaser and the Disruptor. The Phaser is still is still a little bit ahead, just because you have more of them, and because the shield reduction is still pretty low with just 9 per individual shot. The Phaser is still in the lead, but the Disruptor is not trailing that much behind. Then, we'll go further. We'll take in this column, we'll make the same calculation as before, but instead we're using 25. 25 is the modifier for class 10 shields. So basically, this time we're simulating hitting an opponent with a class 10 shield, and doing all the calculation steps as before. Again, we then arrive at this column, which has the theoretical DPS against an opponent who has class 10 shields. Here we actually see something that I didn't expect, but I think is pretty good. They actually don't seem to be that different. I mean, Disruptors seem to pull ahead at this point, just because their base damage is so high that they don't really care about 25 damage being reduced of that. But they're not pulling that far ahead yet, or at least yet. The Gauss is still a pretty viable alternative, and Phasos is also still okay, but they seem to have the Disruptor pulling ahead here. The last column here is against a crazy guy like me, which is basically someone who has class 10 shield and also the hard shields modifier, which gives an additional 6. So you're looking at reducing the damage minus 31 for each shot. You see the Death Ray is just a sort of very far away at this point, and also because the Gauss isn't really having its shield piercing effect anymore, it's also drastically falling off, and the Disruptor starts to really significantly pull ahead, which is, well, it's something. But let's discuss that a little bit more, because what it seems to me is that each of the weapons has some sort of strengths and also downsides. So as I already mentioned, the Death Ray is pretty underwhelming. I mean, sort of looks good with like 20 and then times 3, and it doesn't take up too much space, and maybe it's nice, right? No, it's actually pretty bad. So don't use that. I mean, I might be mistaken with the way that the 3 shots are calculated in. I doubt it though. So, and it also has some flavor text in the weapon that talks about being able to breach even the heaviest armor, which I'm not sure what that is about, but there's some flavor text, so I included the question armor, ? So, then the next one is the Phaser. Surprisingly, the Phaser, even though technically it isn't really high gen at that point where you have fully modified Disruptor, Stellar Converters and all that stuff, it actually seems to still be pretty competitive, and it has the additional advantage that you can start building it earlier, so that you can already build ships with Phasers and then add in the additional special systems later for a small fee of some BCs, without exchanging the entire weaponry. Because if you build an energy boat in the late mid game, then you might have to build this on Phaser, and you can only just include unmodded Phasers. If you try to switch that out for something else later, then you have to pay really a lot in order to do that. So it's really good to see that the Phaser is still competitive. It's not the best. I'm not claiming it's the best, but it's still pretty competitive compared to the Disruptor. Of course, compared to the Disruptor, it has a slightly higher range that has some advantages and disadvantages. I think at max range the range dissipation for the disruptor might actually be higher, but you can hit ships from further afar, so there's some points to be made on both sides there. Also, since the phaser has a much lower cooldown than the disruptor has, if you're fighting against an opponent who has a lot of smaller ships and only a few bigger ships, then having phasers is not actually that bad, because you don't need a full salvo of your ship to take out one ship, and the next salvo is coming up pretty soon instead of later. So against the AI, I think phasers actually pulling ahead of the disruptor, because even though the energy weapons connect pretty instantly, you're probably losing out damage just because your weapon system has fired already, even if you spread it out among all weapon groups. Now that I think about it, you may have wondered why I spread out the weapons against on multiple subgroups. That is mainly because if you spread it out, then they can engage multiple enemies at the same time instead of just one, which should help you against a large amount of smaller opponents. Supposedly, if you're only shooting at one, then they'll not all come at the same time, but I think that's still okay. So there's that. Thanks for the guy who pointed that out in the comments on my last video about this. Thanks. So phasers might actually be better against AI. Disruptors, talking about disruptors. Disruptor is definitely the most effective against well-protected and sturdy ships. Refitting your entire fleet with disruptors is expensive and can be an issue. So my estimation is that if you have to start building phaser energy bolts earlier because you're dragged into a confrontation before you wanted to, then don't just refit the entire ship with new weapons and that stuff. Just keep it as a legacy design, give it the new subsystems, and just construct a new design with disruptors that you can build, so they have something against battleships. But if you're looking at disabling big slow ships or even stationary stations, then torpedoes might actually be just the better weapon choice, or stellar converters, or various amount of other things, and maybe not energy weapons. So there's that. So what did we learn? We learned... Oh, I didn't talk about Gauss for some reason. We learned that I didn't talk about Gauss. Sorry. You can see here that even if you ignore the no range dissipation factor that the Gauss has, the damage is actually not that bad. I mean, it's looking here at against Shield Class 5, it's much more than half of the amount of DPS that the Phaser or Disruptor have. At Class 10, if it works as I think it should, it's actually pretty similar. So further calculating in the no range dissipation, it should actually be better against Class 7 and 10 shields than the Phaser and Disruptor. However, you can get countered really hard by hard shields, or if they don't work for some reason with Class 10 shields, or I don't know. So that's Gauss for you. They seem to be pretty effective because you can do the full damage no matter the range. But if it has hard shields, then the damage falls off significantly, like a factor of 2. So you don't want to rely on that in that case. So that was Gauss. So what do we learn? Actually, we learned a beautiful thing, which is that there's not such a thing as the one energy weapon that you have to use. Actually, there seem to be, depending on what you're trying to engage, there seem to be multiple weapons that can fit the role. Phasers is sort of a good all-purpose weapon, which can engage everything in a pretty decent fashion. Gauss is insane against opponents who are slightly lower in technological level than you, but against enemies who are comparable to you or using hard shields, you get screwed. Disruptors is sort of the last resort if you want to go for all-out capital ship combat. That seems to be the thing. Alright, so I hope you found that interesting. If you did, like, subscribe, and all that shit. I've never done the call-out like that. But I'll be doing a full playthrough of Master of Orion again once the full release comes out. I only wanted to do this other stuff beforehand because so that I don't have to worry about that when doing a playthrough on release, which I rarely do. So that's that. So if you like Master of Orion stuff, then there's more Master of Orion stuff coming your way in the next weeks or so. So I'll see you next time. Have a good one.